Redemptions and comebacks. We've seen plenty of it throughout the history of Overwatch esports so far. Be it because you're a franchise who had a bad start and you eventually had your turnaround, or because you're a player who was on an incompetent team and you left, or they didn't believe in you. There's been so many examples of it, and today I'm going to go over some of my favorites, and I really hope you enjoy and play along down in the comments if there's ones that you think I missed. And of course, no list would even be worth discussing without first bringing up Fearless, which is the biggest example we have. I mean, people call him the protagonist of the Overwatch League for a reason. He's arguably the most special story we have. Fearless had a pretty brutal start in terms of wanting to find success long-term at the highest level, be competitive, and win a lot of games. It started off okay pre-Overwatch League on Element Mystic. He made a name for himself there on main tank, but then he joined one of the 3 worst teams in Overwatch League history, the 0-40 Shanghai Dragons, and no matter how hard he tried, there was no use. There was nothing he could do to carry this team to a win because they were just that bad. Loss after loss piles up, most games not even being close, and by the season's end, Shanghai weren't exactly optimistic about their current team, it goes without saying, so they made a lot of drastic changes, and that included putting Fearless down to their Tier 2 team in Team CC. So now, Fearless, after getting a shot in the Overwatch League, is gone after not even a full season, and there's no guarantee he can even make his way back. And a lot of people in his exact shoes would probably just give up. We've seen plenty of examples of it. But instead, Fearless decided to keep on going. Overwatch esports was his passion, and he wasn't going to let the dream end there. He grinded his absolute hardest on Team CC over the next year, and he got rewarded for it by getting re-elevated to the Shanghai Dragons main roster in 2020. And from there, the rest is history. After initially splitting some of the playtime with Stand 1 as the main tank in 2020, he eventually took all of the minutes, and he would become one of the most dominant forces we've ever seen, just diffing everybody in that Winston mirror. And just in that first year alone, he was able to kind of turn the corner in his career, winning multiple stage championships and making a deep playoff run with the Shanghai Dragons, which included that insane melee comeback victory, the only time we have seen in a Tier 1 event where a team has come back down 3-0 to win. That enough was already really special, but then we saw what happened afterwards. Wins another stage title after going to Dallas in 2021. Then 2022 ensues, and he not only wins the Overwatch League Grand Finals, but also the Finals MVP. We can all sit here and say that he was able to go full circle. He was able to complete his story in what is arguably the best one we'll ever know in terms of one individual in Overwatch esports history. But Fearless is far from the only example we have of very successful comeback stories. One that I think goes under the radar that you got to appreciate is Birdring and what he went through in his career. Birdring is widely respected, and overall he had a really great career, but there were some moments that were highly questionable that had us wondering if he still had what it takes to be one of the best. There was a very odd transition period with Birdring. Things started off great. Pre-Overwatch League, very successful, one of the better hit scans out there, even makes an Apex Finals on Kangdu Panthera. Then his first season on London goes very well. There was a bit of a road bump with the injury that he suffered, but he was overall one of the best hit scans, and he won an Overwatch League championship. That's a really great start to his career. But then the falling out starts to happen in 2019. This is where he could have gone down many different paths. First and foremost, GOATS comes into the picture, and unfortunately, he just wasn't built to play GOATS. He was horrible at Zarya and a very mediocre Brig. He was a detriment to his team, and London kind of suffered as a result, and people started to criticize him, naturally so. He looked like his head wasn't in the game, and just like that, suddenly what happened the year before was meaningless. And things only got worse from there. Aside from a brief Stage 4 resurgence, playoffs comes around and he's nowhere to be seen. He had a bit of a disagreement with the team from what I know, and that was his end with the London Spitfire, just like that, on such a sour note. Horrible at the first part of the season, benched in the playoffs when the team needed him the most. It was looking bad, and all rumors were indicating that Birdring may consider retirement. He didn't know what his future was going to hold, and in a different universe out there, he probably gives up right here and retires. Thankfully, though, he decided he wanted to give it one more go, despite the uncertainty of not knowing what teams would be interested in him, what teams he'd even be willing to play for. In the end, the Gladiators decided to take that risk despite not knowing what would happen with him and if he even still really wanted to play, and it paid off in the biggest way imaginable, not only for the Gladiators and where their history would go the next couple of years, but for Birdring himself as well. He came onto this Gladiators team who needed a replacement for Surefour, and he balled out. Like, literally right from week one, you could tell he was the carry of this team. He had so many unreal performances on the cast and on the Widowmaker, on the Ashe. He was clawing his way to these victories for a Gladiators team that really wasn't that good, but in the process, he was always absurdly entertaining, and he made a lot of those games way more interesting than they would have been if they had a different hit scan on the team. Birdring was an absolute monster in 2020, and the Gladiators were able to find a foundation with him and Kevster on the team, which obviously led to 2021, where he was still really, really good. Maybe not as dominant as 2020, but him and Kevster had a good thing going on as a duo, and they were able to capture the Gladiators' first ever stage championship. He was a big part of that. Birdring was able to not only prove to the world, but to himself that he was once again one of the best players of all time. Overall, looking at what happened with Birdring, him going to the Gladiators and taking that chance really propelled him into that all-time great conversation, and I'm just glad it happened. I'm glad it didn't end with those first few years on London, because it would have been such a tough what-if to think about, knowing the level of talent that he has. Thankfully, Birdring took the right path, and we have a very special story as a result. Player number 3 I'd like to discuss in this video is Hotba. Hotba's not an ordinary case. He'll never be a legendary player like Fearless or Birdring, but he had to overcome so much. Nobody played on more teams than this guy, and there were moments where people seriously doubted if he belonged in the league, like multiple times. It didn't start off too bad at the beginning in 2018 on Philly, but he definitely lived in the shadow of Poco. Then he went to the Charge the next year, and a lot of people would argue he played really, really well. But unfortunately, they chose to move off of him in favor of an up-and-comer in Krong, which made sense. And that led to 2020, where a big moment in his career happened on NYXL. One of the best franchises in the league up until this point wanted him as their new off-tank alongside Mono. Just knowing how he had played on the Charge, this felt like a great situation to be in and that maybe he found his home. That is until the season actually started, because his playstyle did not mesh with the rest of the team whatsoever, and he had some highly questionable moments that led to him getting benched for a rookie at one point. And when 2020 was done, most fans believed with how he was playing that Hotba was washed. There was no coming back from this. 3 teams in 3 years coming off his worst season to date. Nobody would pick him up in the offseason, and that seemed like the end of Hotba. But then he got offered a chance. The Fusion called him up because they were going to be down Poco at the start of the year because of some visa issues. And this is where Hotba decided to make his final stand to prove that he does belong in the Overwatch League. Through his play on the Philly Fusion, he showed that the NYXL was just a bad scheme fit. He played admirably on the Fusion, and that earned him a new contract for 2022 on the Toronto Defiant. A new start yet again. He had yet to play on the same team for more than one season in a row. Crazy to think about. But on Toronto, he actually helped the team taste the most success they ever did in Overwatch League history. In the Jotes meta, his Junker Queen elevated the team to a top 3 tournament finish in NA in front of the home crowd. A very special moment for him and the Toronto franchise. And he even showed some pretty good leadership in the playoffs before ultimately getting eliminated in a 5-map series against the Spark. It may not have been a career full of accolades and superstardom, but Hotba managed to stick around for 5 whole seasons in 5 different systems while facing a ton of criticism and hate after just one bad season. It takes a lot of grit to not give up after all of that and regain the trust of fans, and Hotba deserves a ton of credit for it. Speaking of Fusion players, we're going to talk about Sado, who had a small redemption of sorts. Not one that lasted all that long, but one that was pretty impactful in the early years of OWL for sure. So 2018 saw him serve a 30-game suspension to start the season because of a boosting penalty. Not a great start to your career. He pretty much missed the entire season and failed to become a household name in favor of somebody like Fraggy, who the fans absolutely loved. And in 2019, things somehow got even worse than him serving all of those games under suspension. The Fusion were an absolutely horrible GOATS team at times, and he certainly was a big part of the reason why, because his Rein play was subpar, and his backline made his life even more difficult. So now here we are, 2 years into his Fusion tenure, and everybody is calling for his head. He was awful when he played, and he missed almost the entire first season because of the boosting thing. Not very reliable. As someone who was big into OWL back then, 2020 during that offseason, I can remember just how much every single fan was begging for the Fusion to move on. And yet, they decided to put a bit more of their conviction in him. They doubled down. People were absolutely furious, and he was the butt of everybody's joke coming into that year. The expectation was that Philly were going to have a hole at main tank. There were no positives to be found in the situation. But then 2020 began, and everybody's tune changed right off the bat. What would follow was one of the top individual seasons of any tank player in that year. He looked phenomenal for nearly the entire season, start to finish. His Rein went from bottom tier to dominant. Absolutely incredible some of the plays that he was making with a better backline backing him and Funny Astro and Alarm. He could just do whatever he wanted, big slams everywhere. You couldn't even recognize the player that he had become. And obviously, he was still really good on Winston. He always was. That's what he was known for. And he just looked confident out there. He looked comfortable. Completely different from the couple of years beforehand. And now everybody was calling him one of the best main tanks in the game after hoping he'd lose his job just a couple of months prior. And it's all thanks to him getting one last chance and the Fusion really investing in him with better talent around him with that support line. Through all the rough times and all the criticism, Sado just kept his head down and he kept fighting. He had a bad start, but he wanted to prove himself on this Fusion team. They finally put a good enough team around him and Carpe, and he was able to soar to new heights. Sado finally had respect. And even though Philly ultimately chose to move on in Season 4, Sado was now a way more desirable player at this point. His play got him one final contract on Toronto before eventually retiring. That 1 year made up for damn near irreversible damage. The whole world was against this guy, but he managed to not only extend his career, but at least for a moment, looking damn good while doing so. Now for a more glamorous player that is a lot more popular in the eyes of the public. It didn't take long for a guy like Rascal to turn his career around, but he certainly had some early hardships that put him in a very similar situation to his former teammate Birdring. Thanks to having too many cooks in the kitchen back in 2018, he barely got to play on the London Spitfire. That was a super team with a lot of good DPS players, and with Prophet being as good as he was just the odd man out, sadly. So in the end, he gets traded over to Dallas, who were an absolute train wreck back then, just destined to lose because of how horribly ran that org was and the general vibes of the team. Despite having some really good performances, honestly, it just made no difference. That team was garbage and they kept on losing, and soon enough, he was not playing anymore for the rest of the year. It was a pretty difficult situation to be in, and now here we were in the 2019 offseason with a very well-respected Korean flex DPS not having a team, somehow needing to prove to the world that he can be a part of a winning culture. There was a world where nobody would sign Rascal out there, and his career might have been over right there and then. But thankfully, the Shock wanted to give him a chance, and over the next 2 years, Rascal became an all-time great player. We're talking a multi-time champion who often started for his team. Rascal not only became one of the best flex DPS of all time, but one of the most flexible in terms of hero pools the game has ever known. He became widely famous and truly unforgettable with his flexibility, being a top-level Brigand GOATS, a high-level Mei player, the literal pioneer of bat play in Overwatch League, and one of the early dominators on Echo. Rascal could pretty much play anything in his prime. He forged unforgettable moments that helped build some of the very fundamentals you see on heroes today. And if it weren't for him joining a team like the Shock, there's a world where none of that ever happens. Rascal not giving up led to this path, from being less valuable than Prophet and traded out of the league to a flex sensation. What a turnaround. The next guy I wanted to bring up in this video is Checkmate. He joined the Florida Mayhem back in 2021 as a backup, and he just wasn't going to get a lot of playing time with Yaki after the incredible rookie season he had in 2020. And when he finally did get his chance, it was unfortunately for all the wrong reasons. Instead of playing DPS like he's supposed to, he got chucked into the starting lineup playing main tank. OG was the only main tank off the roster at the time, and it made more sense logistically to play Checkmate than sign somebody new overseas, potentially having to deal with ping. The result was some of the most epic Reinhardt gameplay you'll ever see for all the wrong reasons. Checkmate got memed into oblivion without ever even getting a real chance to prove himself that year. He was stuck playing tank, and Florida were a lot worse than they were supposed to be. And with 2021's end, the Mayhem cleaned house, and at the time, that did include Checkmate. Some people are quick to forget that Florida originally had no intention to bring this guy back. He had to prove himself after being permabenched for a year through another round of Mayhem trials. And thankfully, he got the second chance that he deserved that led to the level of play that we are fond of still to this day. He was arguably top half of the league at his position even back in 2022. The nightmare of rotting on the bench just to embarrass himself on tank was a distant afterthought with how him and the Mayhem were playing. The man was a legitimate talent on DPS, and he came through in big games for the Mayhem. But more importantly, he earned a spot in the league and as a franchise cornerstone because obviously, as we know, 1 year later, the Mayhem were rewarded for this decision as he not only elevated himself even further, but ultimately they'd go on to win the final Overwatch League championship. From coming into the game as a Reinhardt player when he's supposed to be playing DPS to a literal world champ is one hell of a turnaround, and now even to this day, Checkmate is still balling out on alexyOWL over an OWCS EMEA. I'm really happy for Checkmate because he almost ended up purely being a meme and a meme only, and it's never fun to be in that position, so good on him for having that turnaround and not giving up. Speaking of never giving up, how about Diya, who may have had to endure the longest battle with that? Much like Fearless, who went through the same adversity, he was there on the Year 1 Shanghai Dragons, literally right from the start. I believe he was a Day 1 player, and they never won a single game as we mentioned earlier. He had some great moments, but it was never nearly enough. And after that first year, Shanghai were looking to go in a new direction, like again I said earlier, and the fatigue of last year needed to be erased, so they had to replace him with a crazy hitscan prospect in Diya, a major upgrade at the time. Diya was still a part of the team, but he was a two-way player basically, and he only got to play one map if memory serves right, and obviously it was a long ways away from being a starter and having a very successful career. But then luckily, moment number 1 came for Diya that kind of turned his career around to a certain extent. After 2019 ended, he found himself needing to prove himself, and luckily, the Shanghai Dragons decided to let him fully join the academy team. Team CC would end up winning contenders numerous times with him on the roster, even winning the prestigious gauntlet against the best tier 2 teams across the world. He looked better than he ever did on Shanghai, and many fans were arguing at that time that he should get another chance in the league. But sadly, those pleas for attention went unnoticed. He was winning games, he looked good, but there was no Overwatch League contract to be found. 3 years of grinding just to not be picked up by anybody, just wasting away. It all seemed like it might be coming to an end for him. He did what he could, but maybe Overwatch League wasn't meant to be after all. But then, through a beacon of hope, he got another chance in the league, when the underdog Los Angeles Valiant picked him up for the 2022 season to play in the APAC region. And funnily enough, this felt like the 2018 Shanghai Dragons all over again at the time. An underwhelming underdog that possibly could lose every game they play. But after living through that hell once already, Diya made sure that would not happen again. This time he would win games, and his team would be scrappy throughout the entire year, going to like 10 map 5s or something ridiculous like that. Diya finally got to be a star, and he'd get the best of some really good APAC players that were on hitscan, and He had those fun moments on Junker Queen as well during the Jotes meta. The Valiant, of course, failed to make the playoffs in the end that year, but it was such a pleasant surprise to see how good that team was, despite what their roster suggested they would be. And Diya got to be a part of the Overwatch League again, after missing out for 4 straight seasons. It was a huge moment to see him get his redemption, the long journey he had to take from 2018 Shanghai to this point. To get that second chance at life as a beloved figure in the community was phenomenal. To see him get that chance when we all knew he deserved it was very heartwarming, and ultimately it closed the chapter on one of the most important stories in Overwatch esports history. Then we have Bernar, and this one's pretty short and sweet. He started on top of the world as an excellent prospect on the Fusion University. They were a dynasty of contenders back in the day, but he could never really find a home that could make use of his potential when he joined the Overwatch League. As a rookie, he joined the 2020 Spitfire as a promising player, and a lot of people thought he could be a great off-tank right off the bat, but his team was not nearly good enough to compete. Not to mention that at times he was splitting playtime alongside fellow off-tank Clestine, which in hindsight is absolutely criminal, but it is what it is. The org was lost for a lot of that year, and they were in no position to let Bernar be the player that he knew he could be, so he decided in 2021 to join the Hangzhou Spark, who looked like a bit more of a promising situation. Unfortunately for our good friend Bernar, though, he joined the team at the wrong time. The 2021 Spark were a divided franchise that were horribly managed, and by the time they did figure it out in late 2022, he was permabenched for Gushwei in a Winston meta. So by 2022's end, the Spark obviously chose to go in a different direction. They wanted to go full Chinese. They weren't playing Bernar anyway, so he found himself without a team for almost the entirety of 2023. But just when all hope seemed lost, the Outlaws reached out right in time for the 2023 playoffs in need of a Sigma player, originally Zarya, and Bernar answered the call. And not only did the Outlaws make the grand finals thanks to him revitalizing the team, but he played arguably the best Overwatch we'd seen out of him to that date. He finally got an opportunity to play on a real team, he got to shine with them, and we saw the result. And that alone was great for his career. It could have ended there, and I'm sure a lot of people would have been very happy, the Bernar fans out there. But the Outlaw stop was just a prelude, if anything. It jump-started his prime to where we see him now as one of the top tanks in the world playing for Zeta Division and OWCS 2 years running. Getting just one chance in the playoffs on Houston has prolonged his career and has put it to new heights. The last player on this list is going to be WhoRU. He never necessarily had any god-awful seasons, but his career didn't start off all that grand, and by the end of his rookie season, let's say, there are a lot of questions about his flexibility and if he was a worthwhile starter in the Overwatch League. At the beginning, he joined New York, which was kind of weird at the time, back in 2020, with a chance to take the mantle from Libero, just to see minimal playtime, and to see Hoxel take his spot as the Genji player in the Summer Showdown. For a legend like him, someone who was so good back in the day, this was such a sad start to his OWL career. And because he seemed to be such a raw prospect in 2020, with a lot to prove, nobody gave him a starting gig in 2021. Instead, he rode the bench on the eventual champion Shanghai Dragons with no real hope of playing ahead of Fleta. With the way that the game was being played, Genji just wasn't all that good. There was no purpose. But then 2022 happens, Overwatch 2 comes around, and everything changes. Genji is suddenly being very prevalent again in early Overwatch 2 as they tried to figure out the meta. And obviously, this has always been WhoRU's best hero. No matter what the situation is, if he's meta, you can count on him with his mechanics to be as good as the other Genji players, if not way better. It was his best hero, it always has been, so it was a no-brainer to throw him in there ahead of Fleta, who was never that great of a Genji to begin with. And the repercussions for this choice literally changed everything. Because this man went out there and dominated from here on out in his career, up until, I'd argue, somewhat in the present day, maybe not that much on Genji, but recent memory. Just big play after big play for Shanghai, a focal point behind their Summer Showdown championship. He was the best Genji in the league by a mile. The prodigy that we'd been waiting for finally arrived, and he's basically gone crazy for almost every team he's played for since then. The decision to let him play in 2022 basically started a second prime. From a multi-time bench rider to a league icon, and widely regarded as the greatest Genji player of all time for what he did on Shanghai, what he did randomly in 2023 trying to go on a run with O2 Blast, and what we saw a little bit of in OWCS as well. This is what happens when you give somebody this talented the right tools to succeed, and I guess a little bit of luck as well. Getting that second chance changed absolutely everything for WhoRU, and has made him an even more legendary player than before he joined OWL. And lastly, to end this video, we're going to discuss a couple of orgs. In particular, the bottom 4 from the Overwatch League inaugural season standings. The Shanghai Dragons, Florida Mayhem, Dallas Fuel, and San Francisco Shock. They were the 4 worst teams in the inaugural season. None of them came close to success, and they all had a long way to go in one way or the other. But when it was all said and done, despite them all having a very horrible start to their legacies, they all ended up having their moments. The Shock were tanking in 2018, hoping that the young players plus a good offseason could propel them, and that's basically exactly what happened. They had a good core in place, and they built upon it for 2019. They added Coach Krusty. They signed striker Rascal and Violet. The team was inexperienced, but very talented, and they cashed out on that instantly. They go from being irrelevant to making every single stage playoff that year, even winning in stage 2, dominating, barely losing any games on the year, and eventually hoisting up the trophy at the end of that season. And that alone was enough to complete the story, but they managed to do so much more. Going on to win back-to-back in 2020, getting to another grand finals in season 5, that is just absolutely insane. They went to the finals in 3 out of the 6 years, half of the time, 50%. And along the way, they established a culture as the winningest franchise in OWL history. It's crazy to imagine that the beginning that they had eventually led to this. Then you've got the Dallas Fuel, who I briefly mentioned earlier with Fearless. They were a huge letdown in the first half of their existence, and in Season 1 in particular, it was insane that they went from being a potential super team to being a literal meme. In general, though, very horrible the first 3 years, only 2 stage playoff berths to be found, and a horrible losing record. But then they get blessed by a bunch of Korean superstars all wishing to take their talents to the same team, and the rest is history. From a perennial drama-farming loser to a dominant Season 4 and 5, which ended with a championship, plus 2 tournaments along the way. The culture change, the shock of it, was just an insane magnitude that I don't think we've even seen to this day ever again. They went from having all of these washed up pros and never being able to stay out of headlines to having guys like Fearless and Sparkle and Fielder and Hanbin represent their organization. It was an incredible turnaround, and they got blessed with that luck. And ultimately, again, they went from meme to living the dream. You got the Shanghai Dragons in 2021, on the other hand, who maybe had the most special story of all. They went from 0-40, having the worst season ever in all of esports, arguably, because of the sheer number of games that they lost, to basically having 2 redemption stories in one. 2019 alone was pretty impressive because they were able to win a game, and they had that unbelievable Stage 3 playoff run as well. That alone was already a really good turning point. But then what happened in the next few years just took it to a completely different level. In 2020, you have one of the best records in Overwatch League history in regular season. You win 2 tournament titles. You have one of the greatest comebacks, if not the greatest comeback in esports history. Fledo wins Overwatch League MVP on your team. You have multiple role stars. You make the final 3 that season. And then the next year, you win 2 more titles, and you win a Overwatch League championship. And in the end, they end up being one of the most dominant franchises in OWL history, despite having that 0-40 start. And then there's the most recent example with the Florida Mayhem, the guys who took the longest to figure it out. They were absolutely horrible for half of their existence, essentially. 2018, they were a joke. 2019, they were the biggest joke. 2020, they had a short turnaround just for it to be a disaster again in 2021. But then 22 and 23, they finally figure it out. They finally get the right building blocks in place. They're able to make some trades where they need to. And they go from an absolute joke and the most horribly ran organization to competing in tournaments, being a scrappy, enjoyable team to watch, and eventually winning in 2023, where someone wins the regular season MVP as their star tank player, and they're able to cruise through the playoffs and become OWL champions, making it look easy out there, completing the cycle alongside their bottom four brethren. All four of these teams took different paths to get here. Some had to be more patient than others. Some had a better plan in place than others. But in the end, they all got to the end goal that they desired. They all were able to hoist up a trophy despite being the worst of the worst at the very beginning of the league's existence. And to me, that's just a really special storybook type of ending to put on the Overwatch League. And that is going to do it for some of my favorite Overwatch League / Overwatch esports redemption stories of all time. Let me know what your favorite redemption stories are down in the comments below, and I'd appreciate it a lot if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more Overwatch esports discussions just like this. I've been ATP, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Peace.